Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Jason White and this is Jason's Weird Reads, and today I'm going to be talking about 10 horror books that I think need a movie adaptation. Now, I am not completely knowledgeable on all the movies that have been made, so there's a possibility that some of these movies have been adapted and I'm unaware of. And if that's true, just let me know deep down there in the darkness. But this is my pick. This is what I would love to see as a horror movie, and because I enjoyed the read so much that I think it would be fun to see it on the big screen. Now, there's a couple of factors I took in considering this list, and one of them is it had to have sort of cinematic feel in the first place, or at least I feel would transition well into a cinematic version. There's a couple of things that I think people should take into account when they're watching that adaptation, is that the filmmaker will often take the story and then incorporate their own vision into that story instead of just adapting it word for word and plot for plot. And I think that's probably the way it should be done, but I think it's also fun to imagine books that you've read as visual movies, as they are. And so this is also what this list is. These are movies that I think would be fantastic to see on the big screen with very little changes. Having said that, I think that it would also be cool if whoever did adapt these books and put their own spin on it would be fine as well. So let's get into this list. First up, I have one of my top 10s of 2022, and that is Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This book is a space horror book where the main character is sent to investigate this derelict spaceship. It was like a vacation cruiser type ship that disappeared and has now reappeared, and so they board it and find terrible things. Now, my one big criticism of this book is that there's a strange middle part where, well, the story is split up into two parts, what I just described and then sort of the after, and that first part isn't finished. We don't finish that storyline. We're just suddenly cut off and we jump into the second half, and I did not like that. But I think that one thing they could change to make this into a good movie is they could probably rearrange it a bit so that it's just one linear type story with what happened in the past, or just keep it as a linear story. Or they could even make it into two parts, part one and part two of two separate horror movies. Who knows? Despite all that, I think this would make a very fun read in the vein of like Event Horizon, or even I think Event Horizon is the best description. The whole idea of checking out a derelict spacecraft that's been missing for years is pretty common trope in space horror, but I'm all for it. I'll eat that up. All right, next up is Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. I think I did this list before somewhere else, or maybe even here, and this was on it because Mongrels, for some reason, gave me some strong Near Dark, that old vampire film from, I believe, late 80s or early 90s with Bill Paxton. I love that movie. That movie is one of my favorite vampire films. It's very brutal, and it's kind of hard to watch in certain points, but I just love it. And although Mongrels is in no way, shape, or form Near Dark, it had some Near Dark vibes to it. Maybe that's intentional, I don't know. But Mongrels is about a traveling family of werewolves. So instead of vampire, a traveling family of, and it's a found family in Near Dark. So you have a traveling found family of vampires in Near Dark. In Mongrels, you have an actual blood relative family that travel like almost like they're traveling gypsies. I think they often joke within to themselves that they're traveling gypsies within the book itself. And so certain circumstances arise because of their traveling habits and the fact that they're werewolves. Because of those vibes I got, those Near Dark vibes, I would really love to see this adapted into a movie version with, honestly, with some similar vibes to Near Dark. Next up, I have Shelter For the Damned by Mike Thorne. I don't think there's enough cosmic horror stories out there, and I think this would be a fantastic one. Kind of shows the difficulties of being a young child, or at least a preteen in American and to some extent Canadian suburbia. And the idea is, in this story, is there's the main character sees this shed that he becomes obsessed with, and the one thing I really loved is the shed kind of disappears every so often, so you have to wonder if it's actually even there. And I think this would make a wonderful sort of weird tale for the big screen. Next up, I would love to see Sakilina. This one's a tie. I couldn't decide. I either want to see Sakilina or Shiloh by Philip Fracassi made into the big screen. Shiloh because it's a weird Civil War film, American Civil War film, and it's, for the first half of it, it's nothing but battle and life in the field, but then something weird happens during a battle that you kind of follow to its kind of what the fuck ending, and I absolutely love that book. I've read it twice, and both times it disturbed me. There's just the brutality of war. When I talked to Philip Fracassi a year or two ago, I asked him how he got to that. How did he, come to that sort of brutality? And I can't remember what he answered, but it's still something that fascinates me. It's like, how do we know exactly what war is like? I guess we don't until we're in it, but what I read in Shiloh, it felt very real, and so we'll stick with that, I guess. It's a very good book about the American Civil War, as I mentioned, with some weirdness thrown in. I highly recommend it. And Sakilina is basically a boat trip gone terribly wrong. This one involves something that's very natural, and although there's not necessarily an explanation as to why it happened, you sort of get the idea that this could happen in real life. And I just absolutely loved it. It's another fun romp. You can't go wrong with Philip Fracassi, but both these stories would make it very interesting movies. Shiloh would have to be big budget, I think, in order for it to work. 'Cause war movies don't work at all if they're low budget, I don't think. But Sakilina could be definitely like an independent, even art house type film. The Worm and His Kings by Haley Piper is next. This is another cosmic horror. There's a theme in this list. I'd like to see more cosmic horror on the big screen. And this, The Worm and His King, it takes place in the old, forgotten, and abandoned subway systems below New York City, and I think to some extent the sewers that are no longer used. And that right there is fascinating. I think that would make a great movie just for that alone. But the fact that there's this cosmic sort of horror element to it, then you're taken to like some very interesting places. This, I think, would make a fantastic movie. But Haley Piper isn't. She's not a stranger to her work being made into a movie, as I believe there's a movie of one of her pieces coming out this year, which I'm hoping to check out. But I think The Worm and His Kings would make a wonderful film as well. Next up, I have Moon Crusted Snow by, I'm gonna butcher his first name, so I'll just say W. Rice. He's a Canadian indigenous person, and this book takes place in one of the reservations. I believe it's in northern Ontario, and this book could be a little bit like The Thing. Not that there's a thing like monster in it, there's not. This book is actually more of a post-apocalyptic book. What happens is they're in the reservation way up north. They're almost completely cut off from civilization as it is, but they do have internet, and one day the internet goes out, and then and it doesn't come back. They're used to the internet going out. It'll go out for days, but it usually does come back. Somebody will come along and fix it. And then their power goes out, and nobody fixes it. And so they start wondering what's going on down south in basically our civilization. What's going on down there? There must be something. And pretty soon they got a couple of guests who come and confirm their worst fears, that something terrible has happened. And I forget exactly what it is, or if it's even explained, but something bad has happened. Now, the reason why I think this would make a great book or movie is because they could really capture, like in The Thing, they could capture that sort of paranoia and the wonder at what's going on. I think it would make a very interesting and intense, especially when the guests come, because the guests, they're not friendly. They're not here to share. They're here to take, and so it creates a lot of interesting tensions. And I would love to see it on the big screen. It would be interesting for one reason. You get to see life on a reservation, which is we don't get to see too often, and then you get the high tension parts that would be just a lot of fun to watch. The next is a book I haven't read in a couple years. It went out of print, but I believe it's coming back into print either 2023 this year or 2024, and that's The Serpent's Shadow by Daniel Brom. This is a Mayan horror book, so it takes place in the Mayan ruins. I believe, I forget if it's at Puerto Rico or if it's in Mexico. Pretty sure it's Mexico. But the premise is you have a brother and a sister who are vacationing with their parents, and they decide to go visit a Mayan ruins that's pretty much off, they're not allowed to go there, but they go there anyway. And while they're there, they meet this other group of kids that the one main character kind of becomes obsessed with, both the Mayan ruins and one of the girls in that other group. I think we need more Mayan horror because that's just from my understanding, the Mayans were kind of horrific people with the way they sacrificed people. They loved their they loved sacrificing people, and they did it publicly, and it seemed like people were all there for it. That to me is horrifying. I don't know how accurate that is, but it seems to be historically accurate from my understandings, and so it makes sense for there to be a lot of Mayan horror, and I would love to see Mayan horror represented more on the big screen, and I think Daniel Brom's book would really, really do well in that format. Next up, I have Crota by Owl Going Back. This book is just a fun creature feature, summertime, popcorn-eating, fun horror book. I think it would just transition very well onto the big screen. Small town discovers this creature, and it starts killing everyone. And if you wanted to keep some of the gore, that would be a lot of fun too. I think if filmmakers who want to recreate that 80s feel, that 80s horror movie feel, would do very well in adapting Crota by Owl Going Back, because, well, it was written in the 90s, I think, mid-90s, but it really has that 80s horror movie feel to it, and I adore Crota by Owl Going Back, and I would love to see that adapted to the big screen. Next up, I think this book would make a really great art house type horror story, and that's The Cipher by Kathy Koja. This book is about a hole in a guy's closet in the floor of a guy's broom closet in his apartment that he and his girlfriend can't figure out where it leads to. It seems to lead to another dimension, and they start experimenting by putting things into the hole, because when they put things into the hole, it comes back altered or gone altogether. It's just a weird, very dreadful piece of fiction, and it would be very, very interesting to see it on the big screen with the atmosphere it's written in. You would really need to bring that atmosphere, and it's of course possible, and I would love to see it. And lastly here, I have Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This book is so dark. I think it would make a great movie because of the content of the story, and mostly because of the content of the story. There's a weird thing going on in the story where a woman's fairly adult. I think he's like 18 or something, and he dies in a car accident. And so she's mourning his loss, and she can't get over the loss of her son. She's very much attached to her relationship with her son, and so she ends up bleeding on the place where he died, and that night she sees his ghost, and it's demanding more blood from her in order to see him again. And so as you can imagine, this leads into some very, very dark places. I think, with the idea of like French cinema, if you've ever watched any French horror movies, which I can't necessarily recommend unless you're really interested in being disturbed. It could go into that sort of territory. Maybe not as extreme, obviously, because this isn't an extreme piece of horror, but it sort of borderlines it because of the content that Laurel Hightower tackles, and it's very heart-wrenching read, and I think that aspect right there could definitely translate very well into a cinematic format. Alright, so that's all I have for this issue of horror books I think should be movies. Tell me what you think you would love to see. What horror books have you read recently or in the past that you would love to see adapted? Tell me deep down in the darkness. Thank you for watching. Keep being safe, keep being creative, and I'll catch you guys in the next bookish video.